So I'd like to introduce a new segment to listeners. This segment will really be a series that I expect will probably span the next 4 or 5 episodes of this podcast. This segment represents an effort on my part to put together a practical guide for students and also parents to some of the schools in the United States that have what you might call a great books curriculum, or at least a liberal arts tradition that's strongly rooted in the Western literary tradition. I think the evidence shows that many of our once great colleges are now failing our students. Students, at least in the United States, are mortgaging their futures for a substandard product. Today, in the U.S., we expect every single young person to go to college, even young people who have no interest in college and no interest in learning. We want every single young person in the U.S. to take out a big loan that they'll be paying off well into their 50s, pick a major, shell out the big bucks, and devote years of their lives to living in these adult sleepover camps. Now, all of this can be worth it for some students, but not all students. Americans owe over $1.5 trillion in student loan debt, spread out among about 44 million borrowers. That is $620 billion more than the total U.S. credit card debt owed. In fact, the average student loan debt for class of 2017 graduates was $40,000, and this was up 6% from the previous year. And most certainly will go up this year as well. And if the loans you've taken out are unsubsidized loans, that debt begins accruing interest immediately. If they're subsidized, which is a better way to go, that means that the government pays the interest until you graduate. But regardless, many students aren't able to pay this debt back. Right now, the student loan delinquency rate is at something like 12% or more. And so students are putting all of their faith, all of their money, all of their parents' money into these institutions of higher learning. And these institutions are failing us. Now, I want to make this perfectly clear at the outset. I know that college graduates on average make more money than those students who only possess a high school diploma. I know that. And so that is evidence that the marketplace and employers still want to hire college graduates. A college degree has a real value in an increasingly competitive labor market. And so I do think that good students, high-achieving students, students with curiosity and talent and drive and passion and ambition and an innovative spirit should still go to university. I do think that. That shouldn't render universities immune from criticism. College has never been more expensive. In fact, the universal availability of student loans is one of the biggest factors driving up the cost of college. Before the growth of the college loan industry, colleges used to have to keep their costs down. In 1980, a year of college cost just over $3,000. Today, the average cost is around $25,000. And this spike in cost is a direct result of government, with its seemingly unlimited supply of cash, throwing endless amounts of money at these universities, who in turn have no reason to keep their costs down. You see, government subsidies drive up demand for college education because students have more money to spend, even if it's money they'll never be able to pay back. These universities know that students basically have unlimited funds. I would know. I was recently a student, and on day one of school, the government offered me $22,000 based on my financial status. I accepted, clicked a box to e-sign, and the money was in my account minus the tuition that it paid 2 days later. So it's really easy to raise the cost of fees and tuitions at these colleges, and they do raise the costs every year beyond the rate of inflation. And of course, the subsidies that the government offers increases demand for college, which in turn leads to academic credential inflation. Today's master's degree is yesterday's bachelor's degree, and so on. The other thing skyrocketing the cost of education is the expansion of university administration. For example, take the University of Michigan. I just read an article about this. The University of Michigan currently employs a diversity staff of nearly 100 full-time diversity administrators. More than one quarter, quote, 26 of them earn annual salaries of more than $100,000, and the total payroll for this small army is $8.4 million, unquote. Here's another quote from the article. According to Department of Education data, administrative positions at colleges and universities grew by 60% between 1993 and 2009, which Bloomberg reported was 10 times the rate of growth of tenured faculty positions. Even more strikingly, An analysis by a professor at California Polytechnic Institute at Pomona found that while the total number of full-time faculty members in the CSU system grew from 11,614 to 12,019 between 1975 and 2008, the total number of administrators grew from 3,800 to 12,183, and that is a 221% increase. Just to be clear, I use UMichigan as an example, but this is happening at most of the large schools, public and private, the schools that they call R1 institutions. And so beyond the safe spaces and the trigger warnings and all of the microaggression talk, the bias response teams, the deplatforming of any speaker to the right of Bernie Sanders, the cordoned off free speech zones, and all of this, beyond this culture of coddling and censorship in which these universities have to pay $600,000 to bring someone like Ben Shapiro, a mainstream conservative speaker, to campus, beyond all that, you now have these armies of diversity bureaucrats running around with quotas, race baiting, putting up posters telling kids how to speak, think, act, and dress, telling them which Halloween costumes they can wear, and which art exhibits microaggress which groups, creating segregated safe spaces for the students. Now, I don't like any of this, but all of this can still be worth it if you're like my wife or my brother who choose to major in a field like engineering or math or nursing or computer science or business, or if you're someone who goes into law or medicine. The hard sciences and the various professional programs, for the most part, are still worth doing. These disciplines are not politicized the way that humanities disciplines are, and they still have a strong grounding in facts, practical methods, best practices. But for a student who is passionate about English literature, say, or anthropology, and this is really advice for parents at this point, I would really recommend some deep, careful thought and consideration. The social sciences and humanities have become, and it pains me to say this, they've become a bit corrupt. That is, many schools and many entire disciplines within the academy, mainly those disciplines that are part of what we call the humanities, as well as several of the social sciences, have lost sight of their original mission. And their original mission should be to teach students to read well, to write well, to speak well, and to become adept at solving complex problems. As the 1,800-member nonpartisan academic group Heterodox Academy puts it, quote, "Many American universities are typified by an ideological monoculture." But this is wrong. Universities are supposed to be places where debate can happen, where heterodoxy reigns, and where culture can be transmitted. And when I say culture, I mean what Matthew Arnold defined as the, quote, "best that has been thought and known in the world," unquote. Jordan Peterson, the former Harvard professor, now University of Toronto professor and best-selling author, recently defined this problem at the Aspen Ideas Festival in Colorado. Here's a clip.
You recently said that what universities have done is beyond forgiveness. I wonder if you can explain what you mean by that?
Well, they're overwhelmingly administratively top-heavy. And they don't spend any more money on the faculty than they did 30 years ago. And the cost of that administrative top-heaviness, which is well documented, not by me, by other people, and it's been that way, it's been accelerating over the last 20 years, has been a radical increase in tuition fees, especially compared to the radical decrease in price of most things over the last 20 years. Now, so they've become administratively top-heavy. The way, and this is especially true in the United States, the way that's been managed is that unsuspecting students are given free access to student loans that will cripple them through their 30s and their 40s. And the universities are enticing them to extend their carefree adolescence for a 4-year period at the cost of mortgaging their future earnings in a deal that does not allow for escape through bankruptcy. So it's essentially a form of indentured servitude. There's no excuse whatsoever for that. It means the administrators have learned how to pick the future pockets of their students. And because they also view them in some sense as sacred cash cows and fragile, let's say, because you might wonder why the students are being treated like they're so fragile. It's like, well, we don't want them to drop out now, do we? And we can't, if they drop out, then we don't get our hands on their future earnings in a way that they can't escape from. And that cripples the economy because the students come out overladen with debt that they'll never pay off right at the time when they should be at the peak of their ability to take entrepreneurial risks. So they can't do that because they're too crippled by debt. And so that's absolutely appalling. They're gerrymandering the accreditation processes so that the degree no longer has its credible value. They're enabling the activist disciplines, which have zero academic credibility whatsoever in my estimation, and I'm perfectly willing to defend that claim. And by enabling the activist disciplines, they're allowing for the distribution of this absolutely nonsensical view that Western society is fundamentally a patriarchal tyranny, which is absurd on at least 5 dimensions of analysis, but is becoming increasingly the thing you have to believe if you're allowed to speak in public. Well, that's what else? That's a good start. They're not teaching students to read critically. They're not introducing them to great literature. They're not teaching them to write. It's like the list goes on and on and on.
Do you think in a way that you are a symbol of higher education's failure? Meaning the reason maybe that people are showing up, 5,000 people to listen to you, it's going to be 20,000 in London in July, is because there aren't that many people who unironically are talking about what it is to live a good life and asking questions about how to live a meaningful one. If you would say that in most universities, I feel that you would be laughed out of the room.
Well, it would depend on how you said it and to who, but if you say it to students, then they're so happy to listen to you that they can hardly stand it. Because even the most cynical students come to university hoping that there's something there worth learning. Mm-hmm. And the reason that they're exposed to great literature, for example, because there is such a thing, it's not all power claims, is because great literature contains the key to wisdom, and you need wisdom in order to live without undue suffering.
And of course, I agree with everything Jordan's saying here. But instead, universities are teaching students that the great ideas of history are, quote, white ideas, and that what matters in life, what is substantive about life, and this is what universities are telling our students, what matters in life springs forth from a person's identity, from their race, their class, their gender. When my wife was getting her PhD at Cornell, I went to a party with her. My wife is a scientist, but at this party there were 3 young women. They were English majors. And of course, when I found out that they were English majors I could talk to at a party full of scientists, I flocked to these women and they had all come together. And so I asked the first woman on my left, "So what do you study?" And she said, "I study race, class, gender, and disability in Victorian literature." The second one says, "I study race, class, gender, sexuality, and trauma in 20th century American literature." And the third one says, "I study race, class, gender, sexuality, and colonialism in contemporary world literature." And so that's pretty much how it works now. In the humanities and social sciences, instead of taking students through the great conversation of history, instead of introducing students to the thinkers, thoughts, ideas, and documents that have shaped history in a balanced way, professors are teaching students that the West is fundamentally corrupt, that all truth is subjective and relative. They're teaching students that one's permission to speak about certain topics and to make claims about complex phenomena is dependent upon their identity, not upon the facts on the ground, but upon the person making the claim's identity. Liberal arts professors are teaching students that they live in an oppressive patriarchy and that some vague, shadowy institutional discrimination is lurking around every corner, even if no proof is offered. And they're being taught, students are being taught, that the fundamental thing to focus on in the study of literature or ideas is the author's race, class, gender, and or sexuality. And additionally, what are the politics that emerge out of that book? If a classic story contains instances of misogyny, like Updike's work sometimes do, they must be erased from the canon. If the story contains offensive language or racist characters, that happens in life. Racism happens in life. It's awful, but it happens. Like Mark Twain's Huckleberry Finn does. It must not be read. right? If a work features women characters who aren't brave, muscular, intractable, proud, man-eating characters like Xena, warrior princess, and if the equitable distribution of those characters doesn't live up to our standards of equity and representation, well, we have to change the curriculum. And so the focus has increasingly become not about substance. The focus is not on substance. It is not on aesthetics. It isn't even on truth. It isn't on the ideas. The focus instead is on social justice and feelings and inclusion and equity. Equity means now, has come to mean equality of outcome. And this stuff is leaking out into the larger world beyond academia. And many of these schools, and I know this because I have a degree both in philosophy and a degree in English. At many of these schools, a student can get a degree in English without having to take a course that focuses on grammar or the history and structure of the English language. At some of these universities, students do not have to take a course on Shakespeare or medieval literature. And so these students get their degrees, they do an education program that lasts 13 months, and suddenly they're teaching your kids. And this is what's happening, and it's becoming more and more apparent and blatant. Case in point, I was recently at an AP literature training, a week-long AP Summer Institute session, and I tell you, I was literally the only person at this thing who believes that teaching the Western classics is a worthy endeavor. There were probably 20 teachers at this session, and not a single one of them, besides myself, believed that there was an inherent value in teaching and defending the Western literary canon at all. I mean, not even partially. Complaints that I heard while I was there were, it's exclusive. It's made up of dead white males. It's hard. It's hard for our kids. They can't read it. It's oppressive. Many of the books, and I'm not making this up, one woman at the training said, many of these books contain micro-invalidations. I have no idea what that is, but apparently our literature contains instances of micro-invalidation. There aren't enough black books and Hispanic books, one teacher said while I was there. I don't know what a Hispanic book is, so I asked, I said, what's a black book? What's a Hispanic book? She had no answer. At one point, we were instructed to read Their Eyes Were Watching God. Their Eyes Were Watching God is a brilliant book by the African-American author Zora Neale Hurston. Brilliant book. Just a terrific, terrific book. That book, in fact, is in the Western canon, right? If you actually go and read Harold Bloom's The Western Canon, you'll see at the end of the book, Harold Bloom makes a list of what he thinks are the great works that belong in the canon. Their Eyes Were Watching God is a 20th century canonical work. So we were assigned to read this book, Their Eyes Were Watching God, and I brought up Richard Wright's famously negative, scathing review of Their Eyes Were Watching God, and I said, hey, I mean, if you're going to read this book, the teacher had asked us, what are some suggestions? What would you add to the curriculum? How would you teach this? And I said, hey, if you're going to read this book to your students, you should also read this review by Richard Wright. And then I explained how much I disagreed with Richard Wright's assessment of the book. Richard Wright basically argued that Hurston's language stereotypes black people. It contains the stereotypical sensual language used to describe black people and so on. And Richard Wright, argued essentially that Hurston's work was too universal. And that a book like Their Eyes Were Watching God should be more overtly political and should work to advocate for specifically black progress, etc., etc. And now, what I told the class was that I think that students should read this essay because it can start a really important conversation and it can get students discussing what is the telos of a great work of literature, what is the value of great literature. Now, I should say, right at the outset, I think Richard Wright is a brilliant, genius writer. I think his books, Black Boy and Native Son, are standard 20th century Western canonical works. But I disagree strenuously with his take on Their Eyes Were Watching God. Their Eyes Were Watching God is an aesthetic masterpiece. It's brilliant because of, not in spite of, its universality. It tells a compelling, powerful story written in masterful prose. There is rich figurative language and symbolism, well-developed characters, etc. So I took issue with Richard Wright's negative review of Their Eyes Were Watching God. And what was the response? What was the response from the class when I told them that I personally disagreed with Richard Wright's review, but that I thought it would be worth teaching? I was told by a woman sitting a few seats away from me that who was I to make claims about such an issue? Richard Wright believes what he believes for reasons that someone of my background could never understand. How could I make claims about Richard Wright's review? Now, I publicly disagreed with the woman and basically said that identity politics breaks us into tribes, and do we really want to live in a society in which I can't make claims about a certain literature because of the color of my skin? Does this advance us? And how does my critique of the literature depend on the color of my skin? I mean, that makes no sense. Either my argument is valid, reasonable, sound, evidence-based, and in line with the facts, or it isn't. But the fact of the matter doesn't depend on my identity. It's like, so here's a good test, actually, to determine whether or not you're arguing in good faith, or whether your argument is rooted in an ad hominem form of attack, or whether it's rooted in claims of identity politics. Take what I said back at that AP training. According to the woman I mentioned, my critique of Richard Wright is wrong, ignorant, invalid, ill-formed. Okay, now maybe it is. But now replace me with an African-American man. Let's say that instead of me, a white guy sitting there, let's say that there was an African-American man sitting there who made the very same utterance. Just replace us and have the African-American man make the claim I made. Would that suddenly make the claim previously stated correct, true, valid, acceptable in this case? If when he says it, it's true, and when I say it, it's false, that's when you know that you've made a logical error. It's an ad hominem appeal, and it's a mistake rooted in the politics of tribe and identity. Now, I bring this example up. Well, I bring it up, one, because I was just at the training less than a week ago, but also because this view is mainstream, and it dominates the academy. One of the striking notions that I learned from attending this training was an odd double standard that seemed to be almost universally accepted among the teachers at this training, and I want to share this with you. This came up about 15 times, and nobody questioned it. In fact, I didn't even question it, because it is taboo to question it. And here's the double standard. I noticed that when the class talked about all white populations, and we did an exercise in which the teacher, the AP instructor, went around and asked the racial makeup of each of our populations and recommended books to use in our instruction based upon the race of our students. When the subject for discussion was the all-white population, we were told that we should use a multicultural curriculum. In an all-white suburban school, students, we were told, should read a spectrum of books by multicultural authors. They should read books by African American authors, by Asian authors, by Indian authors, by Native American authors, by gay authors, by trans authors, by Caribbean authors, etc. Because look, these white kids need to get outside of themselves, experience the world, learn from other cultures, experience some humility, learn from the other, learn from the marginalized outsiders, see how others live. Literature is about learning from those who are different than you. And I actually happen to agree with this sentiment. But what I think she meant was different in all of the ways that matter, like skin color and sexuality, but those aren't the things that matter. But here's the double standard. When the class talked about Hispanic, Latino, Black, Native American students, on the other hand, when the teacher came to someone who actually did have a population of Hispanic students, say, for example, the important thing in that case was to pick a curriculum filled with authors who look like them, right? If you have a diverse population, if your population is largely Black students, if your population is largely Hispanic students, in that case, for some reason, this was never explained to me, you have to choose authors whose works feature characters who share the identities of those students, right? If you have a population of Hispanic students, you need to choose books about other Hispanic people. Students need to see themselves in the text. Otherwise, they won't be able to get into the literature. So white people have to read about other people, which I would agree, that's actually a great idea. We should read literature from diverse authors. We should experience what it's like to be in another person's shoes. That's great. But when we're talking about diverse students, people of color, they have to read literature that matches their own race. But see, this is a terrible way of looking at a student. This notion treats white students as pale, bland, colorless, self-absorbed oppressors who need to come down from their high place and empathize with the oppressed other to get a richer and fuller sense of the world. And it treats people of color, conversely, as mere exemplars of their race, class, and gender. And the only way we can get through to them is by appealing to these immutable surface characteristics from which we believe their identity and their mind and their soul and their spirit and their personality springs. So people of color, by this view, are mere avatars of their race, their sexuality, their gender. That's who they are. And they won't read the literature if it isn't about someone else, written by someone else who shares a group membership with them. But white people, those pesky suburban white kids, they need to experience otherness. And they are perfectly capable of identifying with others and getting enjoyment from a work of literature, even if the characters are different than them. Okay. So I'm getting a little off track here, but my overall point is that this is what students are being taught. These are the ideas that teachers have as they enter the field of education. These are the things that our AP trainers are teaching incoming teachers. This is what is taught in many of the corrupt disciplines that make up our humanities departments. And I'll be honest, and I'll list the disciplines that I would argue this applies to, because this is a guide for students and parents. I'll list the fields that I feel like are oriented by and grounded in what you might call identity politics and a kind of postmodern neo-Marxism that looks at civilization, that looks at Western civ, that sees the marketplace of ideas as a Hobbesian battleground between competing identity groups warring for power and influence. Everything in these disciplines that I'm going to list, everything is socially constructed. Reason is a tool of the patriarchy, trade is exploitative, women are oppressed, etc. And these disciplines that I do not recommend my students enter, these disciplines are English, comparative literature, sociology, education, increasingly anthropology, and pretty much any major that ends in the word studies, and that would include women's and gender studies and the various ethnic studies majors. And it's not like you need to take my word on this. Simply go to the website of the nearest major university and visit the website of, say, the Gender Studies Department, and simply read what they do. You'll see that invariably all of the professors are on the hard left, and the disciplines are activism-oriented. They're activism-centered. The point is to teach you what to think, rather than how to think. For example, I live in Amherst, Massachusetts. My wife went to UMass Amherst for engineering, and so I visited the Gender Studies Department website at UMass Amherst. I'll read the opening description. Here's what they say they study. Here's what they say that if you attend their gender studies program, here's what they say you'll learn. And this is a quote from the website. The Women, Gender, Sexuality Studies program at UMass Amherst offers a robust interdisciplinary set of options, including an undergraduate major, an undergraduate minor, and a graduate certificate in advanced feminist studies. We are committed to interdisciplinary and intersectional analysis, in which the study of women and gender is multifaceted, diverse, and embedded in a network of power relations, including race, class, sexuality, and nation. The field views and analyzes intellectual problems and issues of current concern through the perspectives of gender, class, race, ethnicity, nationality, sexuality, and ability. Students think in this program about challenges faced by marginalized, or not, individuals in both domestic and foreign spaces, and work to conceptualize solutions that can be applied in communities around the world. Core courses for the major explore new methodologies in feminist scholarship and study critical race feminisms, transnational feminisms, and sexuality studies. I can't even read that. So here's the question. Do you think I'd be welcome in any of those classes? Do you think that you would be welcome in any of those classes? Or maybe you think that I'm being unfair. Maybe you think that gender studies is too much of an extreme example. It's not like very many students major in the gender and ethnic studies disciplines. How about English? What do students who study at UMass Amherst, I hate to pick on UMass, but I live a mile away from UMass and I have a deep personal connection to that school, and I think it's a good example of just your run-of-the-mill, large, modern, public R1 institution, and it's fairly reflective of general trends, I would say. Let's visit their site and look at the work that their fine graduate students are doing. What does the research focus on? So I visited the website, and their English department, like most English departments, lists the titles of their graduate students' dissertations. And I'm just going to read through some of these dissertation titles on the list, and that'll give you a sense of what the scholars there research, what the teachers teach about, what kind of research the students do. Okay, I'm going to list some of these titles. And these are the dissertations that students spend years working on. So I'll list these in order. The most recent go first. Sex and Difference in the Jewish American Family. Incest Narratives in 1990s Literary and Pop Culture. Quisqueyanas Valientes en este Espacio, I can't even read that, Dominican Women Writers in the Spaces of Contemporary American Literature. Wow, that one wasn't even in English. Civic Domesticity, Rhetoric, Women, and Space at Hull House. Here's another one. The Blackness of Blackness, Meta-Black Identity in the 20th and 21st Century African American Culture. Okay, here's the next one. Waiting for Now, Post-Colonial Fiction and Colonial Time. Latina Identities, Critical Literacies and Academic Achievement in Community College. Demanding Spaces, 1970s U.S. Women's Novels as Sites of Struggle. Theaters of War, Performing Queer Nationalism in Modernist Narratives. Enduring Affective Rhetorics, Transnational Feminist Action in Digital Spaces. Sustainable Public Intellectualism, The Rhetorics of Student Scientist Activists. Homosexuality is a Poem, How Gay Poets Remodeled the Lyric Community and Homosexuality is a Poem, How Gay Poets Remodeled the Lyric Community and the Ideology of Sex to Theorize a Gay Poetic. Affecting Manhood, Masculinity, Effeminacy, and the fop figure in Early Modern English Drama. Here's the next one. Our Story Has Not Been Told in Any Moment. Radical Black Feminist Theater from the Old Left to Black Power. Writing for Social Action, Affect, Activism, and the Composition Classroom. A multidirectional memory approach to representation of colonization, racism, and genocide in literature. The Guerrilla Tongue, The Politics of Resistance in Puerto Rican Poetry. And here's the last one. Technologies of Racial Formation, Asian American Identities. Asian American Online Identities. Okay, so that was actually difficult to get through. My point is that so much of this stuff discourages intelligent mainstream students from entering fields like English and sociology and education and psychology. Do you know anyone who really and truly deeply loves reading that would be interested in any of that stuff? The politicization of these fields can really work to discourage and alienate students who are truly passionate about reading and learning and knowledge. And I would argue that the regressive, illiberal atmosphere that is being created at some of these places is also pushing students away. It's keeping students out of the humanities. And what you have is a great big polarization. You have a giant divide. Moderate and conservative students stay away from the humanities because their ideas, their worldview is not accepted. And not only is it not accepted, it's maligned as being evil and racist. And so there's a single narrow dogma, a monoculture, an ideological homogeneity dominating the humanities right now. And the humanities are being overrun by radicals. A friend recently shared an article with me from the Wall Street Journal that I'll admit was hard to read. The article is titled, White Informed Civility is the Latest Target in the Campus Wars, and it's by Stephen Salerno, and I'll read a little segment of it. This is pretty astonishing stuff. And this is a quote from Salerno's article in the Wall Street Journal. From the land that irony forgot, which earlier gave us microaggressions and trigger warnings, comes a new and surprising movement, this time to combat civility. Civility, you see, is a manifestation of the white patriarchy. Spearheading this campaign are a duo of University of Northern Iowa professors who assert that civility within higher education is racialized rather than universal norm. Their article in the Howard Journal of Communications describes a need to stamp out what they call whiteness-informed civility, or WIC. The pervasiveness of WIC, it seems, erases racial identity and reinforces white racial power. Who in the world knows what that means? I'll go back to the article. Their thesis can be a tad hard to follow, unfolding as it does in that dense argot for which academia is universally beloved, but their core contention is twofold. One, that civility as currently practiced in America is a white construct. Okay, so now if you're civil to someone, that's white supremacy now. Two, in a campus setting, the woke white students' endeavor to avoid microaggressions against black peers is itself a microaggression. So even when you don't microaggress people, you're microaggressing people. And I'll go back to the article. A form of noblesse oblige, where white students are in fact patronizing students of color when they don't microaggress them. Not only that, but by treating black students with common courtesy and expecting the same in return, white students allied black grievances, bypassing the race talk that is supposed to occur in preamble to all other conversations. Got it? So the article then goes on to talk about how this stuff is leaking into other fields and endeavors, how this new trend is changing the norms of classroom discussions at a lot of these colleges, and how it's actually now seeping into the field of competitive debate, the college debate teams and such. Salerno writes, quote, and I'm almost done here. Finally, there's a recognition in the academic space that the way argument has taken place in the past privileges certain types of people over others. Joe Leeson Schatz, director of speech and debate at Binghamton University, told The Atlantic, "Arguments don't necessarily have to be backed up by professors or written papers. They can come from lived experience." Classroom protocols are under attack as well, the article continues. A primer titled Diversity and Inclusiveness in the Classroom, produced under the auspices of the University of Arizona, asserts that classroom debate, quote, must be an accessible space, and that sharing should be based on one's own feelings, experiences, and perceptions. Students are pointedly discouraged from rebutting feelings that don't jibe with verifiable reality. Should someone slip up by introducing a challenging fact, however, the text has a prescription. If a student feels hurt or offended, the hurt student can say, ouch. So there you have it, folks. If anything I say offends you, if the facts I discuss or the literature I read doesn't jibe with your feelings, experiences, and perceptions, just say ouch, and I'll be sure to issue a formal mea culpa apology during our next episode. Okay. So stepping back from all of this, and I'm sure we could go on all day about the politicization of the humanities and social sciences, all of this I bring up as a preface in order to introduce a new segment in this podcast. This segment will be called A Guide to Great Books Colleges, and again, the segment represents an effort on my part to put together a practical guide for students and parents to some of the schools in the United States that have what you might call a great books curriculum, or at least a liberal arts tradition that is strongly rooted in the Western canon. Because it does pain me to recommend to my students that they shouldn't major in English, because despite my earlier rant about the failure of colleges to transmit wisdom and provide value for students, at the end of the day, do I think that certain students who have a real passion for the humanities and social sciences disciplines that are less obviously practical, which often don't put students directly on a track to a professional career and which on average sometimes don't lead to high-paying jobs, do I think that some students are suited for these disciplines, the wisdom disciplines? Absolutely. I still think that students should go into the wisdom disciplines. Many students can thrive in these disciplines and develop viable, rewarding futures in this way. But it's become increasingly clear that this side of the educational landscape, the humanities and social sciences side of things, has failed to provide the kind of value that parents and students deserve. And yet, there is hope. There are many good schools out there that are still committed to debate and the rigorous examination of ideas and philosophies, schools that still do expose students to the great conversation of history, schools that have high expectations and high standards, schools that are dedicated to transmitting wisdom, dedicated to teaching students how to read well, write well, and think well, schools that are dedicated to developing in students the ability to think critically and to take intellectual discourse seriously, schools dedicated to pursuing and discovering the good, the beautiful, and the true, who introduce young minds not to the latest intellectual fads, but whose orientation is geared towards inculcating in students that collection of qualities that Cicero called humanitas, which includes the cultivation of judgment, taste, and civic virtue. That's what college should be about. So I'd like to kick off this segment by introducing listeners to the first schools that made the cut. I'll say right off the bat that I haven't ranked these schools, nor have I placed them in any particular order, but each episode for the next 3 or 4 episodes, I'll talk in depth about several schools that still offer students the classical liberal arts experience, schools who in explicit name, or at least in spirit, still offer what you might call a great books education. Now, when the series has finally come to an end, what I'll do is I'll splice all of these segments together and create out of them one long guide for parents and students who wish to send their children to a great books college. And the first school to make the list is the University of Chicago. So the University of Chicago, the great books education has been a cornerstone of the liberal arts and humanities programs at the University of Chicago. Early great books proponents like Robert Maynard Hutchins, Mortimer Adler, and Alan Bloom all taught at the University of Chicago and helped to promote the importance of a great books education. In fact, during his first term at the University of Chicago in 1931, Mortimer Adler teamed up with then-President Robert Maynard Hutchins to teach a 2-year general honors course modeled on the Great Books program at Columbia University, launched by John Erskine. So while the University of Chicago doesn't have a core great books program a la Adler, Bloom, and Hutchins that students must take, the spirit of the Western Canon is still very much alive at U Chicago. But one of the primary reasons to celebrate the University of Chicago is the institution's long-standing commitment to fostering freedom of expression and freedom of speech. Recently, Jay Ellison, the Dean of Students at the University of Chicago, he issued a statement basically responding to this atmosphere of safety culture, of safe spaces, of trigger warnings. The Dean of Students came out and said, quote, "Members of our community are encouraged to speak, write, listen, challenge, and learn without fear of censorship. You will find," and in this letter he was speaking to the incoming freshmen and their parents, "you will find that we expect members of our community to be engaged in rigorous debate, discussion, and even disagreement. At times, this may challenge you and even cause discomfort." And he adds that Chicago's, quote, "commitment to academic freedom means that we do not support so-called trigger warnings, we do not cancel invited speakers because their topics might prove controversial, and we do not condone the creation of intellectual safe spaces where individuals can retreat from ideas and perspectives that are at odds with their own." And he said all of this with the full support and approval of the university's president, Robert Zimmer. But the great thing about the University of Chicago's commitment to free speech and open debate is that all of this is actually codified in the university's Report on the Commission of Freedom of Expression. This is a famous document. It's really a statement of principles that other schools can adopt if they want to, and have adopted, in fact. And I'll read a few excerpts from the report. The report begins, I quote, "In 1902, in his address, President William Rainey Harper declared that the principle of complete freedom of speech on all subjects has from the beginning been regarded as a fundamental in the University of Chicago, and that this principle can neither now nor at any future time be called into question. 30 years later, a student organization invited William Z. Foster, the Communist Party's candidate for president, to lecture on campus. Even back then, in 1932, this triggered a storm of protest from critics both on and off campus. To those who condemned the university for allowing the event, President Robert M. Hutchins responded that Our students should have freedom to discuss any problem that presents itself. He insisted that the cure for ideas we oppose lies through open discussion rather than through inhibition. On a later occasion, Hutchins added that free inquiry is indispensable to the good life, that universities exist for the sake of such inquiry, and that without it they cease to be universities. Because the university is committed to free and open inquiry in all matters, it guarantees, and I'm still reading here from the report on the Committee of Freedom of Expression, because the university is committed to free and open inquiries in all matters, it guarantees all members of the university community the broadest possible latitude to speak, write, listen, challenge, and learn. The University of Chicago fully respects and supports the freedom of all members of the university community to discuss any problem that presents itself. Of course, the ideas of different members of the university community will often and quite naturally conflict, but it is not the proper role of the university to attempt to shield individuals from ideas and opinions they find unwelcome, disagreeable, or even deeply offensive. Concerns about civility and mutual respect can never be used as a justification for closing off discussion of ideas, however offensive or disagreeable those ideas may be to some members of our community. The university may restrict expression that violates the law, that falsely defames a specific individual, that constitutes a genuine threat of harassment, that unjustifiably invades substantial privacy or confidentiality interests, or that is otherwise directly incompatible with the functioning of the university. In addition, the university may reasonably regulate the time, place, and manner of expression to ensure that it doesn't disrupt the ordinary activities of the university. But these are narrow exceptions to the general principle of freedom of expression, and it is vitally important that these exceptions never be used in a manner that is inconsistent with the university's commitment to a completely free and open discussion of ideas. And the report ends on this. In a word, the university's fundamental commitment is to the principle that debate or deliberation may not be suppressed because the ideas put forth are thought by some or even by most members of the community to be offensive, unwise, immoral, or wrong-headed. It is for the individual members of the community, not the university as an institution, to make those judgments for themselves, and to act on those judgments not by seeking to suppress speech, but by openly and vigorously contesting the ideas that they oppose. So good stuff here, and at this point I'd like to share a short clip from the half-hour Heterodoxy podcast, put out, of course, by Heterodox Academy, and this clip features Heather Hying. Heather Hying is a former professor at Evergreen State College. Heather recently settled with Evergreen State College, and she was essentially pushed out along with her husband Brett Weinstein after the college melted down last year and became something of an Orwellian nightmare. And she's become something of a public intellectual at this point because of that whole incident. She calls herself the professor in exile, and here she's praising the University of Chicago and its commitment to free expression and academic excellence.
There's a trend now that's fashionable to accede to student demands and to add admin in diversity and equity, and to create safe spaces, and to create student centers representing various demographics, LGBTQ and students of color and Native students, and on and on and on. And that's pretty much everywhere at this point. And certainly it's what we saw happen with extraordinary rapidity at Evergreen under the leadership of the new president, starting, I guess now it's 3 years ago. Any college, and the shining example of this would be University of Chicago, that does the opposite and that says, you know what, we actually stand for Enlightenment values. We are seeking truth. We are going to maximize the search for truth, and in so doing, we will find other values, but that is our top value. Rather than proclaiming that we are, for instance, as Evergreen has and as other schools have, and as Jonathan Haidt has identified this as a sort of a binary choice that many schools are making, you can do a search for truth or a quest for social justice, but you cannot simultaneously maximize both. The vast majority of schools out there are doing the latter, are proclaiming, are advertising to their potential students and to their current students and enforcing on their current faculty and staff and advertising to future faculty and staff. We are about social justice. And that comes at a high, high cost. And I know anecdotally, and I also know not anecdotally, that students are turning away. That at Evergreen, many students effectively looked at that and said, "Not for me. That does not sound." And here I'm putting words into most people's mouths, although I've heard these words from a few people. That doesn't sound like an education to me. So in that climate, if you act like University of Chicago and you say, "We actually we have a creed. We are going to seek truth, and we are not going to let anyone disrupt another individual's right to speak. You may protest, but if that protest ends up being disruptive such that you disable another student or faculty, whatever, but another student's right to hear or ability to hear what someone else is saying, that is not okay." And so if you made that like an opening salvo, a motto, if you would, of the university, and said, come check us out if this looks appealing to you. And if it doesn't, by all means, don't come here. But we're going to hold you to it. And if you end up thinking that it's your right to disrupt other students' rights to hear ideas that you find uncomfortable once you're here, you are going to be asked to leave, and you will leave. I think that that if every university did that, there would be little economic advantage in being first, but there would still be great advantage intellectually in any university that did that. But especially right now, when so few schools are doing that, when so many schools are doing the fashionable thing and hiring more and more admin and staffing more and more offices in so-called equity and inclusion, any school that did the opposite, I think, would actually not just be supporting intellectual inquiry, but also end up winning economically because they'd get more students applying.
That's fantastic. And if you don't know Heather's story, I'll post some links to the website. Just visit www.westerncanonpodcast.com and you can check that out. Okay, up next is St. Olaf College in Northfield, Minnesota. St. Olaf College is a private liberal arts college of the Evangelical Lutheran Church in America. The school was founded by Norwegian immigrants. I actually had a professor who attended this college and who could speak Norwegian. St. Olaf offers students a fantastic Great Books program that I want to talk about called The Great Conversation. This is actually a major at the school, and I'm going to read the description that they've provided. The site says, quote, "The Great Conversation is a sequence of 5 courses that introduces the major epochs of Western civilization to students via great works of human achievement. Beginning with the study of the ancient Greeks and Hebrews, this program traces the evolution of literacy and artistic expression, philosophic thought, religious belief, and the sciences of human behavior into the modern world. Students who complete the program bring a broad grounding in most of the liberal arts to their majors, to other courses, and to their study of other cultures. Students in the program are not passive recipients of information about their intellectual heritage. Rather, they respond to great works in an interdisciplinary way, challenging the ideas expressed in the works and challenging their own ideas as well, thus joining in the great conversation of men and women throughout the ages about perennial issues of human life." And so I should say here at this school, even those students who don't major in the Great Conversation, all students must take a series of 5 courses that vary in focus and scope, from Western Civ and the foundational ideals of America to Asian studies and environmental education courses. Not to mention, each year St. Olaf puts on a world-renowned Christmas festival, so that's something to consider as well. The site brags, quote, "Great Conversation students encounter great works of art. They read epics, plays, paintings, and novels, and philosophical, political, and religious documents. They become acquainted with works from Genesis to the Origin of Species, created by artists from Homer to Picasso. The Great Conversation is a program for those who like to read, discuss, and write about ideas. It is for those who believe that learning about the past is profoundly relevant to understanding the present, for those who want to examine the Western tradition in a unified way, And it is for those who believe that an education ought to cultivate discriminating minds, inquisitive spirits, and moral sensitivity. Wow. Sign me up for that. Okay, and the third and final school I'd like to review this month has the honor of being the first school in our nation's history who refused to discriminate on the basis of race, gender, or ethnicity. That's an amazing feat. And that school is Hillsdale College in Michigan. Founded in 1844 by Christian missionaries, Hillsdale College is both notorious in many ways and selectively rigorous. Hillsdale is a traditional liberal arts college, and perhaps more than any other school that made my list, it is the one most fervently dedicated to preserving and defending the Adler, Hutchins, Bloom, Erskine, Barzoon, Socratic-style great books education. Another distinctive feature of Hillsdale College is that the school is unabashedly and unapologetically conservative in its orientation. What makes Hillsdale different? The school website says, quote, "We believe that the study of the past provides a valuable window into the future. A Hillsdale education, however, is more than just the study of what is good, true, and beautiful. It is in the practice of these things that our education comes to life." In fact, the school is so distinctive and bold in its educational orientation that the New York Times recently did a profile of the school that I want to share with you listeners. The profile offers a surprisingly positive take on the school, given that it's the New York Times and Hillsdale is a conservative school. And I'd like to read the bulk of it here on this podcast. This article, too, will be posted on the website under the tab labeled Links. New York Times writer Eric Ekholm, who visited the school, writes, quote, "At first, Hillsdale College seems to resemble dozens of other liberal arts schools with rich histories. There are statues of Washington and Lincoln, Jefferson and Churchill, and a monument to students who fought for the Union. A point of pride at a college that was founded by abolitionists, visited by the crusading former slave Frederick Douglass, and open to black students and women from its very founding in 1844. Cross the quad on what is known as the Liberty Walk, though, and you will encounter something different. Statues of Margaret Thatcher and Ronald Reagan? In a letter to prospective donors, Hillsdale's president Larry P. Arnn said that 2017 promises a beginning to restore limited government. Hillsdale, a private college of 1,400 students in southern Michigan that describes itself as non-sectarian Christian and is dedicated to civil and religious liberty, is scarcely known in many circles. But among erudite conservatives, think progeny of William F. Buckley Jr., it is considered a hidden gem. What they admire is the college's concentration on the Western philosophical and literary canon, sometimes disparaged as the great books of dead white men, and its reverent treatment of the American founding documents as the political culmination of that tradition, a tradition that scholars at Hillsdale say has been desecrated by a century of governmental overreach, including the New Deal and Obamacare. And again, this is from a New York Times article by Eric Ekholm. And I'll read on. It is no coincidence that Justice Clarence Thomas, an advocate of strict originalist interpretation of the Constitution, delivered the commencement address last spring, likening Hillsdale to a shining city on a hill for its devotion to, quote, liberty as an antecedent of government, not a benefit from government. Conservatives are also entranced by Hillsdale's decision to forego any federal or state funds so as to be unfettered by government mandates. In 1984, in Grove City College versus Bell, the Supreme Court ruled that even Pell Grants for needy students or GI Bill money for veterans subjects a college to federal regulations, and so Hillsdale students are not allowed to accept such funds. Most receive institutional grants. As a result, the college does not follow Title IX guidelines on sex discrimination and the handling of sexual assault cases, and it has refused to engage in the otherwise required reporting on student race and ethnicity, let alone develop an affirmative action plan. George Will, the conservative columnist, praised both the college's independence and its curriculum, saying that, quote, by stressing the great books and Western civilization, Hillsdale has become a niche success. He added, I think it's greatly regrettable that it's only a niche. The soul of Hillsdale is its core curriculum, which largely occupies students for their first 2 years. It includes more than a dozen mandatory survey courses on topics like the Western heritage, with readings from Hammurabi to Hobbes, and American heritage, the Mayflower Compact to inaugural addresses by Franklin Delano Roosevelt and Reagan. Students also study core principles of biology, chemistry, and physics, and take the trademark class on the American Constitution. Beyond admiring the stress on traditional rigor and methods, conservatives more widely venerate the great books approached in a certain way. They laud the reading of original texts, gleaning internal ideas of right and wrong, rather than dwelling on the less noble historical contexts. In principle, studying great books is not inherently conservative, said Molly Worthen, an assistant professor of history at the University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill, who laments that this ground has been largely ceded by liberals. There is a tradition that grew out of ancient Greece and Rome that is shared by modern progressives, she said. But the study of the great books has become entwined with a certain set of methodological assumptions and political or ideological goals. Still, in several classes that I observed, writes the journalist Eric Ekholm, the teachers encouraged spirited debates and broached topics far beyond conservative dogma. Dr. Whalen, for example, an English professor as well as provost, ended his course, Great Books in Continental Literature, with a look at Samuel Beckett's Endgame. What happens if there is no meaning there, but you have an absurd need to express meaning? He asked of Beckett's vision. One student drew a comparison to the music of John Cage, which he had studied in another class. Hillsdale teachings describe the Constitution as a timeless document whose principles have been compromised by the creep of welfare and regulation. If one subject captures the juxtaposition of Hillsdale's path-breaking origins with its present-day conservatism, it is race. From the official catalog, quote, "The college values the merit of each unique individual rather than succumbing to the dehumanizing, discriminatory trend of so-called social justice and multicultural diversity. To me," Dr. Larry Arnn said, quote, "I think it is an urgent thing for the college to help those who are disadvantaged." He cited the charter school initiative as a response that fits Hillsdale's values. Hillsdale has received private grants to foster K-12 schools funded with public money that introduce children to the ancient Greeks and constitutional principles and require the study of Latin. Hillsdale serves as a consultant without payment, again avoiding government funds, providing local organizers a curriculum and teacher training. So far, it is aiding 16 schools, 3 of them, one in Georgia and 2 in Texas, serving mainly minority populations, Dr. Arnn said. And here's a quote from Dr. Arnn from the article. "We, quote, hope that a lot of those students will come here," he said. In the meantime, Hillsdale defiantly claims an exemplary record of opposition to racial discrimination. As if to drive home the point, the college is adding one more bronze to its Liberty Walk this spring, a statue of Frederick Douglass. Okay, so that's where the article ends. And what I found interesting about Hillsdale in doing a bit of research is that the school has a huge endowment. I think it's over $1 billion at this point. And this is one of the reasons that Hillsdale is able to forgo federal funding of any kind. The Hillsdale College website boasts that, quote, "Hillsdale's cost is significantly less than that of other nationally ranked private liberal arts colleges. We're proud to be considered a great value. We also know that college remains a significant investment for most families. In fact, almost all of our students receive some form of aid, including scholarships, grants, loans, and student employment. The average aid package awarded in 2015 was $16,700, with $14,300 in gift aid." And here's a clip from the Hillsdale College website that gives you a better sense of their mission in fostering a great books education.
How do we measure good? Is it defined by the majority? Is it measured by self-satisfaction or personal fulfillment?
The good of anything is found in its ability to accomplish what it was created for. To realize its purpose for existence, as intended by its maker.
only in this realization can something truly be called good. The good is possible only in the light of truth.
Not truth as it is often defined today by personal preference or popular consensus, but truth as it is.
Independent from opinions and emotions. And where goodness and truth exist,
There, you will find beauty.
We were created for a purpose.
Our purpose is not left to chance or whim,
but was determined by our Maker.
and written in our nature.
Our purpose is to seek truth.
In order to discover and to act on what is good and beautiful in this life.
So that's Hillsdale College, and that is the last school we'll be talking about in this episode. This segment, our guide to great books colleges, again, will be an ongoing segment that we'll do here on the Western Canon Podcast until we run out of schools to profile. Next month, we'll take a look at 3 more great books colleges.